What happens if the country next door decided to simply turn off your lights? That question is not hypothetical, and the answer already happened once, quietly, for about 24 hours, to over 1.5 million Americans. In one sentence, Canada already threatened to cut electricity to parts of the United States during this trade war, back down within a day, and almost nobody outside a few border states ever heard about it. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how much of your power grid actually depends on Canada, why that dependence is growing right now because of artificial intelligence, and what happened the one time Canada actually pulled the lever. Let's start with a fact that surprises most Americans the first time they hear it. Canada has been quietly powering parts of the United States for decades. Not oil, not natural gas, actual electricity flowing across transmission lines strung along the northern border into states like New York, Michigan, Minnesota, and much of New England. This is not some fringe arrangement either. For the better part of 20 years, Canada sent significantly more electricity south into the United States than it received back year after year without a single headline. The reason comes down to geography and geology. Canada sits on some of the most productive hydroelectric terrain on the entire planet. Quebec alone generates more than half its electricity from massive hydroelectric dam systems, rivers turned into power plants on a scale most Americans have never seen firsthand. British Columbia and Manitoba operate the same way. Ontario blends hydroelectric power with nuclear. Altogether, roughly 55% of everything Canada generates comes from hydroelectric sources, making it the third largest hydroelectric producer on Earth. To understand why this matters so much to American consumers, you have to understand something about how electricity itself works that is different from almost any other traded good. Oil can sit in a tanker for weeks. Aluminum can sit in a warehouse for months. Electricity cannot be stored at any meaningful scale. It has to be generated and consumed within the same fraction of a second, which means the entire electrical grid across North America operates as one enormous interconnected balancing act, constantly matching supply to demand in real time across an international border most people never think about. When a heat wave hits the Northeast and air conditioners strain the system, or when a cold snap hits the Midwest and heating demand spikes, that balancing act often depends on power flowing in from wherever it happens to be available at that exact moment. And for large stretches of the year, that available power sits just across the Canadian border. That surplus power has to go somewhere. And for decades, the most profitable place to send it was straight across the border. In a single recent year, Quebec alone shipped more than 22 million megawatt hours of electricity into the United States, with Ontario adding nearly 16 million more, and British Columbia contributing another 12 million on top of that. To put that in perspective, that is enough electricity flowing south to power millions of American homes every single year, quietly, invisibly, the same way water comes out of a tap without most people thinking about where it originated. This arrangement built up gradually over generations, transmission line by transmission line, contract by contract, until it became such a normal part of how the northern grid operates that almost nobody stopped to ask what would happen if it were ever interrupted, until last year when someone finally did. Now, here is where the story gets interesting, because in the middle of this trade war, someone in Canada actually tested what happens if that tap gets turned. In the spring of last year, as Trump escalated tariff threats against Canadian goods, Ontario's premier decided to fight back using exactly the leverage we have been talking about. He announced a 25% surcharge on all electricity Ontario exports to three American states: New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. Roughly 1.5 million American homes and businesses were affected immediately. The premier was blunt about it in public, telling reporters that if the United States escalated further, he would not hesitate to shut the electricity off completely, not tax it, not surcharge it, simply turn it off. He did not stop there either. At the same press conference, he framed the entire move as regrettable but necessary, saying he felt genuinely bad for the American families and businesses who would see their bills climb through no fault of their own, and placing the blame squarely on the trade war itself rather than on the ordinary people paying the price. That kind of framing, sympathy for the people paying the bill, combined with refusal to back down on the underlying threat, made the story land differently than a typical tariff announcement. This was not an abstract dispute over percentages on imported steel. This was a politician saying in plain language that he was willing to make your porch light and your refrigerator part of a trade war. Washington did not take this quietly. Within a day, the White House was threatening to declare a national emergency specifically over electricity, and Trump responded by doubling planned tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to 50%. For about 24 hours, two of the closest trading partners on the planet were staring at each other over a light switch. Financial markets noticed too, with stock prices dipping on the uncertainty, a small but real signal that investors take an electricity standoff between two G7 economies seriously, even when the physical amount of power involved is relatively modest. Then, just as quickly as it started, it ended. The Ontario Premier suspended the surcharge less than a day after announcing it, following a phone call with the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, and a meeting was arranged to work through broader trade tensions. The tariff escalation cooled off too, at least temporarily. Life went back to normal for those 1.5 million households, most of whom probably never even noticed their bill was about to jump by roughly $100 a month before the whole thing got called off. Here is the detail most coverage of this moment left out, and it is important for understanding how much leverage this really represents. At the time, the states affected by that surcharge actually got a relatively small share of their total power from Canada, well under 5% in New York's case, and even less in Michigan and Minnesota. Which means the entire standoff, as dramatic as the headlines made it sound, was more symbolic than existential, at least for now. Nobody's lights were actually about to go dark on a large scale. But symbolic moves in trade wars have a way of previewing what happens when the numbers get bigger. And the numbers are, in fact, getting bigger right now for a completely different reason. It is also worth remembering this was not entirely without precedent. Energy has been used as leverage in disputes between neighboring countries for decades, going back to oil embargoes and pipeline disputes on other continents entirely. What made the Ontario moment different was the target. This was not oil sitting in a tanker that could be redirected elsewhere over weeks. It was electricity, already flowing in real time through wires that had existed for decades, suddenly becoming a lever that could be pulled with a single press conference and released just as fast. That kind of immediate, direct control over something so basic and so invisible is rare in trade disputes, and it is exactly why both sides treated it with more caution than almost anything else in this entire trade war, tariffs on steel and aluminum included. That reason is artificial intelligence. And this is the part of the story almost nobody is connecting to the trade war conversation. Data centers that power artificial intelligence models require enormous continuous amounts of electricity, far more than a typical office building or factory. A single large-scale AI data center can consume as much electricity as an entire small city, running around the clock every single day of the year, without the seasonal dips and rises that make ordinary electricity demand easier to plan around. As AI development accelerates across the United States, electricity demand is climbing at a pace the American grid has not seen in decades, and utilities across multiple states are already warning that supply could struggle to keep up with demand in the coming years. This is not a distant theoretical problem. It is showing up right now in utility planning documents and regional grid operator warnings across the country. Tech companies racing to build the next generation of artificial intelligence are not simply hoping the grid keeps up either. They are actively signing long-term power purchase agreements, funding new transmission infrastructure, and in some cases, even considering building their own dedicated power plants just to guarantee enough electricity to keep their data centers running. That level of corporate urgency around electricity supply tells you how seriously the demand crunch is being taken behind closed doors, even if it rarely makes the evening news the way a tariff announcement does. Into that exact moment of rising demand, Canada just deepened its electrical connection to the United States even further. In January of this year, a brand new transmission line connecting Hydro-Quebec directly into the New England power grid began commercial operation, a project years in the making, specifically designed to move more Canadian hydroelectric power into American homes and businesses across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and the surrounding region. This is not a coincidence of timing. It is a direct response to growing American demand for reliable, large-scale power, precisely the kind of demand artificial intelligence infrastructure is driving upward every single month. Think about what this means when you combine both halves of the story. American electricity demand is rising sharply because of AI. At the same time, new infrastructure is being built specifically to pull more power in from Canada. At the same time, this trade war has already demonstrated, even briefly, that Canada is willing to use electricity as a bargaining chip when pushed hard enough. Those three trends are converging at exactly the same moment in history. And almost nobody outside of utility executives and grid planners is talking about what that convergence actually means for ordinary Americans paying a power bill every month. It helps to picture exactly which parts of the country sit closest to this dependence, because it is not evenly spread across the whole United States. New England states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine sit at the very end of major transmission corridors carrying Quebec hydroelectric power south, which is precisely why that new transmission line mattered enough to spend years and billions of dollars building. Upstate New York, Michigan, and Minnesota border Ontario and Manitoba directly, which is exactly why those were the three states targeted by last year's surcharge threat in the first place. If you live in one of these states, the electricity coming out of your wall outlet has a real, non-trivial chance of having originated at a dam in Quebec or Manitoba, rather than a power plant anywhere in the United States, Whether you have ever thought about it or not, let's talk about where this actually goes from here, because there are three realistic paths, and each one affects your electricity bill differently. The first scenario: electricity stays entirely outside the trade war going forward, treated as too sensitive and too symbolically dangerous to touch again after the scare last year. Both governments learned something from that 24-hour standoff, namely that even a symbolic threat to the power grid spooks markets and voters faster than almost any other kind of trade retaliation. In this scenario, Canada continues expanding transmission capacity purely for commercial reasons, cashing in on rising American demand, while keeping electricity itself off the table as a political weapon, no matter how heated other parts of the trade relationship become. This is probably the most comfortable outcome for both governments, since it lets Canada keep collecting steady export revenue while Washington avoids ever having to explain to voters in border states why their power bill suddenly depends on the outcome of a tariff negotiation. The second scenario: as AI-driven electricity demand keeps climbing, American reliance on Canadian power grows large enough that it stops being symbolic and starts being genuinely significant, particularly in New England and parts of the Midwest that already sit closest to major hydroelectric transmission lines. If that happens, the leverage Ontario's premier tested briefly last year becomes real leverage rather than a warning shot, and any future trade dispute involving Canada carries a genuine electricity dimension that did not meaningfully exist before this decade. For anyone living in a border state with rising utility bills, this is the scenario worth watching most closely because it is the one where a distant trade negotiation could eventually show up directly on a monthly electric bill. Watch for this shift showing up first in utility rate filings and regional grid operator reports long before it ever becomes a headline, since these agencies track import dependence closely even when nobody else is paying attention. The third scenario, and the one energy planners on both sides of the border are quietly preparing for regardless of how the trade war unfolds: the United States accelerates its own power generation build-out, natural gas, nuclear, and renewable projects alike, specifically to reduce reliance on any single external supplier, Canada included, as a matter of long-term energy security rather than short-term trade politics. This is already happening in pockets across the country, and if it continues at scale, it could gradually reduce how much leverage Canadian electricity actually carries by the time any future trade dispute reaches a boiling point similar to what happened last year. The tension in this scenario is timing, since new power plants and transmission upgrades take years to permit and build, while AI electricity demand is climbing on a timeline measured in months, which means the United States may end up more dependent on Canadian power in the near term, even while working to reduce that dependence over the long term. Whichever path plays out, the broader lesson here connects directly to everything else we have covered on this channel about this trade war. Every single time, whether it was oil, aluminum, or now electricity, the same pattern shows up. Leverage exists wherever one side depends heavily on the other, and that dependence rarely gets discussed honestly until a crisis forces it into the open for a day or two, then quietly fades from the headlines while the underlying dependence keeps growing in the background. Oil taught us this lesson through pipelines and Asian buyers. Aluminum taught us this lesson through European premiums during a Middle East shortage. Electricity is simply the version of this lesson that hides in something so ordinary, a wall outlet, that almost nobody thinks to ask where the power actually originated. Here is my honest read on where this settles. I do not think Canada wants to weaponize electricity again anytime soon. The backlash and market reaction from last year's brief standoff made that risk clear to everyone involved. But I do think the underlying dependence keeps quietly deepening regardless, driven not by politics, but by simple electricity demand from artificial intelligence that shows no sign of slowing down. That is the part of this story that outlasts any single tariff dispute or any single administration, because power grids and transmission lines take years to build and decades to replace, while political disputes come and go in a matter of months. There is also something worth noting about how differently this story played out compared to oil or aluminum. With commodities like oil and metal, the leverage shows up gradually through pricing and export volumes shifting over months. With electricity, the leverage showed up instantly within a single press conference because flipping a surcharge on or off happens at the speed of a policy announcement rather than the speed of a supply chain rebuilding itself. That immediacy is exactly what makes electricity such a uniquely powerful and uniquely dangerous tool in a trade dispute. And it is exactly why both governments backed away from it as quickly as they did once the initial shock wore off. The bigger point I want you to sit with is this. Most people think about trade wars in terms of goods sitting on store shelves, cars, groceries, appliances, things you can see and touch. But the most powerful leverage one country can hold over another is often something completely invisible, flowing through wires buried along a border you never think about until one 24-hour standoff briefly reminds everyone it exists. The next time you flip a light switch without thinking twice about it, remember that for over 1.5 million Americans last year, that simple action briefly became a bargaining chip in a trade war being fought hundreds of miles away over tariffs on completely different products entirely. So here is the question I want you to answer in the comments. If Canada ever did decide to use electricity as real leverage instead of a brief symbolic gesture, do you think the United States is actually prepared for that? Or are we more dependent than most people realize? And if you live anywhere near the northern border, tell me whether you even knew your power might be connected to Canada before watching this. And if you do not live near the border, ask yourself whether your own state's grid depends on some other invisible connection you have never thought to question either, because this pattern is not unique to the northern border. It exists in power grids all over the world, quietly, until the day something forces everyone to notice. If stories like this, the ones hiding in plain sight that nobody else is covering, are useful to you, hit subscribe, because we are going to keep finding the angles other channels miss. And if you have not seen our breakdown of how Canadian oil and aluminum are already reshaping this trade war in similar ways, go watch those next, because electricity is simply the newest chapter in a story that has been building for over a year now. Understanding all three together, oil, aluminum, and now power itself, gives you a far clearer picture of exactly how much leverage sits quietly on the other side of a border most Americans rarely think about, and exactly how much of daily American life already depends on decisions made in Ottawa, Quebec City, and Toronto rather than Washington. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.